Great. Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our second in a series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Action Week. Today, we are so thrilled to have Jakub Olesinski to talk to us about the NWT Forest Health Program, including the monitoring of forest pests. I want to say a really special thank you to Jakub for presenting today, since his family was just evacuated from Hay River due to the forest fire there. So it's really extra special that he's made it work to join us today. And I'd just like to say my thoughts are with everyone who has been affected by this fire and this evacuation. To get started, I'll just give a brief introduction to our speaker. Dr. Jakub Olesinski has been an ecosystem forester with the Department of Environment and Climate Change Forest Management Division since 2014. He has a strong background in forestry and forest ecology, having previously worked as a research associate at the Canadian Forest Service and as a forester in Europe. In his role at the GNWT, he coordinates the NWT Forest Health Program, including annual forest health surveys and reporting. And in addition, he is responsible for climate change adaptation programming within the Forest Management Division and oversees forest renewal after disturbances. So with that, I will turn things over to you, Jakub, to take us away.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joanna, for the introduction and for having me here in those special circumstances. My thoughts are also with everyone who is affected by the fire in the Katlodici First Nation and Hay River. It's amazing how fast things can change, and one day you look at the river as a threat, and exactly a year later you look at the same river as a savior, as a barrier from the fire. So it's pretty incredible to witness this, and I want to acknowledge Katlodici First Nation because that's where our office in Hay River is located. So I am acknowledging KFN and also West Point First Nation in Hay River and the Métis of Hay River for this presentation, because that's where we are located as a Forest Resources Office. So Johanna already mentioned what I've been doing. I'm a forest ecologist in Forest Management Division, and forest health is just one of the things that I've been working on and been responsible for. And I want to tell you today about a few things that we have been observing in the Northwest Territories when it comes to insect pests and pathogens, looking at tree health side of things, but also, generally about forest health, which is not only insect and disease these days, but more and more significantly, we see things related to climate change and climate impacts on the forests. So I'll be also touching about, how climate has been affecting forest health in general. So we start with, if we can advance the slide, which, I guess going this way. So Forest Management Division mandate is generally two-folded, two main pillars. One of them is to ensure sustainable use of Northwest Territories forest resources and to maintain a forest landscape that is robust and resilient to change. And the second one, very important as well, is to protect people, property, communities, and values at risk from wildlife fire. Very relevant these days. I think it's important to say what healthy boreal forest really is. How do we understand it? Because it is a very special place. It is a place that is disturbance driven, we say in ecology, which means that it does need a disturbance on the landscape to maintain its status, to maintain its perpetuity, to maintain its structure, and fire being the major agent of change is actually very essential to forest renewal, to forest existence. And the landscape that we do see out there is created by fire. So as threatening as it is, and I can, feel it on my skin very distinctly, the threat of it, the fire is necessary to these forests to maintain their health. We can say that forest is healthy. It is when if it's affected regularly by fire at certain intervals. And I think that key word here is that interval, because that's where how fire regime is created by not only intensity of the fires and how they burn, but also how frequent they occur, how frequently they are occurring on the landscape. So understanding this interval and how fires behave on the landscape is really key to understand how healthy the forest is. If we see that those intervals are pretty regular, or they are more or less expected, then we can understand that that the forest is working within its natural cycles, and the same goes for insect and disease agents, which can occur in large numbers over the landscape in massive amounts, and affect forest health. But really, this is how those cycles work, and they are natural phenomenon. And once we understand that these are cyclic events, and we know more or less, what those cycles are, then we can see if our ecology is on track in terms of its health and condition. So yeah, healthy forest means, in boreal context, means that it's disturbed on a regular basis, and that's that way the nutrients are released back to the environment, and trees can renew. Some species of trees are really dependent on fire. For example, jack pine cones are serotinons, which means that they are closed on the trees, and they stay closed for years until they are exposed to heat, which releases, it opens up the cones and releases the seed, and that's how they really renew. So those forests need fire. That's, I guess, in a nutshell, what a healthy boreal forest means. And now, forest health program that we have here, its main goals are to document impacts of pests, diseases, and climate-related disturbances. Also, to respond to public information requests. We have quite a bit of questions every year. What's bugging my tree? What's this pest and what's that bug? Not necessarily a pest. To contribute to national reporting, there is a quite a big interest of what's going on in the north of 60 in the territories like Yukon and Northwest Territories, which have massive amounts of forests that is considered unmanaged everywhere else in Canada. And also use information on disturbances like insect defoliation in timber supply analyses and fire management plannings, because you can imagine that if a bunch of dead trees, fire will behave differently than in a bunch of healthy trees. So that information is also very useful for our wildfire management folks. So how do you do it in a territory like this? I mean, this is a large area to cover. And it's really our main method for detecting issues is through by aerial detection. We use fixed wing aircraft, and we fly predetermined routes every year to capture pretty much all disturbance that we can see that is caused by insect and disease. And you can see the example here on these photos. This is actually the helicopter flight, but still you can see the yellow yellow shape there is kind of encircling the forest canopy that looks different from the surrounding one. And this is actually a willow stand affected by by gray willow leaf beetle. And if we go down on the ground and check those leaves, you can see that though they are very pretty much consumed by this beetle. And based on this discoloration of canopy, we are able to actually map areas that are affected, and knowing what host species is affected and timing of the disturbance, we can pretty much have a very educated guess of what the damaging agent is, and we can produce maps with those disturbances, with the severity. We also collect information on severity of defoliation, and if we do not know what the agent is and what the damage is, because we sometimes are not able to make that educated guess, then we would be taking a helicopter and trying to land as close as possible to the disturbance and verify it on the ground. That's really the only way to do it. Not always possible. Sometimes some things get only mapped but not really identified, but those are not very often occurrences. So to support our aerial detection, we also do ground surveys, and those would be done along all our highways, mostly in the southern NWT, so Dachau, South Slave, North Slave. And that's where we actually are able to confirm suspected agents on the ground. We have a chance to dig behind the bark and check, the actual species. Those would be areas that would not be visible from the air, sometimes emerging issues that are only visible when you really look close and not really something significant from the air. And also, this is also the best opportunity to collect samples, which we would further investigate. So, as I mentioned, large territory, all the green area in this map is actually forested land in the Northwest Territories, over 80 million hectares, so larger than any European country, maybe except for Russia. And so enormous area. And across the years, over the years, we identified some priority areas, and you can see that they are focused along the rivers and major tributaries of main rivers. And that's why this is because that's where white spruce, the host for the most important pest species in the Northwest Territories, occurs. So white spruce is the host species for spruce bollworm, which is our most serious pest, and we want to have a good understanding of where spruce bollworm is and where it is active, and that's why these areas are monitored on a regular basis every year uh, with this fixed wing aircraft, as I mentioned. So there is about, if we are lucky and we survey all these areas, then we cover approximately 23.8 million hectares. But more realistically, it is about 14 million hectares that we cover out of those 80. Much of those 80 million hectares is in the shield, Canadian shield, which is not as affected by insect and disease as, for example, the southern part of the territories, where we see a lot of different agents working, a lot of also climate-related damages. And the last method that we are using is the pheromone trapping. Basically, pheromone is a secreted or excreted chemical factor that triggers a social response in members of the same species, and they are often used to help monitor populations of various pests. That's how they look like on those photos. On the left side, you can see the trap for the spruce bollworm that we use, the green one, and the funnel type trap for bark beetles, and also the bait that was actually attached to a tree. And this is that one in this example is a mountain pine beetle bait that we also try to monitor to check for to verify absence presence. So basically, pheromones are not really long range tools. They will not attract any pests or from outside for distances larger than 1 kilometer. So it's not really something that you would that would threaten, introducing new issues to the area if they haven't been there already. Those are mostly for detecting absence presence. So if there is any agent in question in a given area, the pheromones help you to detect that, and also to monitor the population levels. So basically, for the spruce bollworm, we are capturing moths, and based on those numbers, you can actually, from year to year, estimate how those populations vary and predict damage that way. So they're really useful tools for more kind of a dialed in estimates. And the downside, they require easy access. You need to be able to get to them fairly often to clean them and to count. to count those trapped insects, and that's why we only can use them along our main road system. So at the end of the cycle, once we collect all the information, we produce a map or a report really with all the mapped issues. And this is just an example from the 2019. So you can see that there's different colors of blobs actually indicating different issues ranging from biotic like spruce budworm and other pests to abiotic, which is also something like high water tables or flooding on the landscape or slumping or things simply that we see affect forests directly. So that kind of map with targeted maps for each area or region, we place in our annual report, which is available publicly online for each year. And also this information is presented on the national level at the National Forest Pest Forum, Management Forum in Ottawa every year. So now I'm going to go through some of the most important pest species that we map and see in our forests. So first one, as I mentioned, is spruce budworm, the most significant forest insect pest. It is really the damaging agent is larvae feeding on current year needles. When they're very, very small, the first instar of the larva gets into the bud, and that's why it's called budworm. And then pretty much damages the new needles. And so that's why you see the defoliation only on the outside of the tree and on top. That's where the youngest needles are. And in Western Canada, the primary host for this pest is white spruce. And when populations are high enough, black spruce can also be affected, but this is not really preferred species. In other areas of Canada, like in the east and Quebec, spruce budworm will attack mostly balsam fir. So in our parts, it's white spruce. In the east, it's balsam fir. So does it kill the tree? Well, it can if the defoliation is really severe and it will repeat for several years in a row. And that's what actually is happening in many areas of the NWT. We see some pockets of areas regularly affected by spruce budworm, and that's where you actually start seeing some mortality settling in. And right now we are in the middle of a huge outbreak. Actually, I can, I think, advance the slide where you see the status for the 2022 situation. So all these red blobs on the map are actually areas defoliated by spruce budworm. Anywhere you see white spruce these days, that's where you see spruce budworm. It's actually, as you can see on the graph, the population buildup was going on since 2014, 2015 after the big droughts. Then things gradually built up. 2020 is an odd year because that's the COVID year. We only surveyed southern part of the territories. That's why we didn't really capture the proper amount, and it's underestimated. But you can see 2021, 2022, over a million hectares affected by spruce budworm. So extreme population levels, mostly in the Decho and also South Slave. But also we see some increases along the Mackenzie and Carcajou rivers near Norman Wells. So it is pretty much everywhere, especially in the south. What can happen also, which is tricky when you map these things from the air, is when you have a heavy flower and heavy cone crop, because flowers and cones on the white spruce are kind of brownish, and that's exactly what you look for when you fly and you look at those brownish red tops of trees. That's the sign of the defoliation. So this is where we had a challenge this year to actually differentiate between the two. And I think that was an issue more in the north than in the south, but it can be quite a challenge to distinguish these things. Requires really trained eyes for that. So this is a really interesting slide because it refers to understanding of those natural disturbance regimes that I talked about when I talked about fires intervals and how the or insect outbreak intervals, how it changes over time. So basically, what we see here is how those outbreaks were changing. The range of the outbreaks have changed over time. All the green areas are defoliation mapped in the 50s, 80s, up to the late 90s, pretty much. And you can see that we started seeing outbreaks moving further north along the Mackenzie River, um, starting in early 2000s. And in 2010, it actually we saw big outbreaks along the Arctic Red River uh, beyond the Arctic Circle. So that was one of the milestones. And then in 2015 was the culmination of this trend, where we saw a huge outbreak in Mackenzie Delta, which is a prime environment for spruce bottleworm. It is a pure white spruce, magnificent trees, large and old. That's what they like. But in the past, the conditions over there were not favorable enough for them to erupt in the outbreak level to defoliate a lot of area. But in 2015, I mean that must have been the conditions must have been good enough for those large numbers of spruce bottleworm to actually affect over 100,000 hectares of those forests. Now, it didn't last long. Usually, outbreaks of spruce bottleworm can last 3 to 4 years, but that one only lasted for 1 year and it collapsed. Obviously, it's not a really yeah, super friendly environment for spruce bottleworm, but the fact that it occurred is significant, and we connect this to climate change. Really, all that progression northward is, to me, one of the greatest examples of how climate change impacts our forests, and that's definitely one of the signs, I think. Another pest, forest tent caterpillar, pretty devastating for aspen. Aspen trees. We had two main outbreaks in 1995 to 1997 and 2014 to 2016. So both of them lasted about 3 years, and both of them came from the south after the big drought. So that's one of the things that links them, I think, is the when we have a severe drought, trees get stressed more, and it just coincides with those cycles of forest ant caterpillar to follow those drought years and attacking the trees. So first outbreak was in the Liard Valley and in the 90s, and the more recent one was along the Slave River and South Slave. Generally in the South Slave, we saw a lot of defoliation. So you can see the aerial photo is really showing you how it looks like when you try to map it. So basically, you would see this forest, aspen forest, as green, but it's not anymore. It's kind of grayish, and when you fly closer, you can actually see the naked branches during the outbreak. Another one, aspen serpentine leaf miner. So this is something very, very common. You can see it on every aspen tree almost in the territories, and it's hard to miss. Those are larvae that make those kind of maze-like pattern on the leaves. Um, Again, do they kill trees like the forest ant caterpillar? They do not. They just defoliate the trees. Aspen are pretty resilient. They can grow several generations of leaves during the growing season. So, but they are just weakened. They are just stressed and succumb to other pests. So, the same goes for aspen serpentine leaf miner. So there's a few photos here. So you can see here the aerial photo. Again, this healthy aspen, and you can see some patches of the healthy aspen within those. Those would be more kind of greenish, and the rest of it, the silvery kind of color of leaves. This is all leaves defoliated by this serpentine leaf miner with all that maze-like patterns on the leaves. It can be very widespread. Everywhere where we see aspen, we can see that pest active. So it's pretty much throughout the range of aspen, and it's been here for many, many years now. So that's an interesting photo here that just showed up. It's actually aspen serpentine leaf miner leaf with some aspen sawfly feeding on it. They don't mind at all. And when we have a really bad year, So that's an interesting photo too, taken near Fort Smith. We can have 4 different agents on the same tree, on the same leaf even. So you can see uh, forest ant caterpillar. You can see that the leaf is actually bitten by caterpillars. And then we have aspen serpentine leaf miner, aspen blotch leaf miner. So those are the blotches on the leaf, and gull midge. So those gulls on the leaves also. So there's 4 different things actually on that tree. Pretty hard for aspen. They're pretty beaten up here. Moving on to willow defoliators. Again, willow blotch leaf miner is the most common willow defoliator in the Northwest Territories. We can see it mostly along the rivers, along Mackenzie, as far north as Fort McPherson. Not really in the delta yet, but as again, this is one of the indicators for us of climate change. You know, if we see this pest very far north, that tells us that conditions again are changing and they are more widespread. So willow blotch leaf miner, it's really hard to map it because it appears in patches here and there wherever we see a willow. Some years are better than the others. Wet years seem to not be as affected as dry years. So usually during the drought, it is more pronounced on the landscape. And yeah, and another one is gray willow leaf beetle, and that's the defoliation you can see in the middle photo there, and the grayish, the gray looking like willow. This is just the new pest that we see here. And the last one is the northern tent caterpillar, so a cousin of forest tent caterpillar, frequently seen together. So when we have an outbreak of forest tent caterpillar, you can see those northern tent caterpillar on willows and roses and bushes as well. And I think that's what Yellowknife residents reported mostly, seeing a northern tent caterpillar when we had this outbreak in 2016, 17. Northern tent caterpillars were all over the place here in Yellowknife. Okay, so this is the photo of the gray willow leaf beetle that I mentioned. So on nice healthy leaf, and here is the larvae that is actually making the damage, and that's what the kind of a skeleton-like damage that it does to the leaves. And some statistics for the willow defoliators. This is going to 2017. I did not have here my most recent map, so I apologize for that. But basically, it's in the ranges of between 10,000 hectares to 40,000 hectares, depending on the year. Pretty dynamic, and the area affected in those. I think this is for those 3 pests. So willow blotch leaf miner. The last time we saw it, gray willow leaf beetle, we don't see it anymore recently, and northern tent caterpillar. Now I wanted to talk briefly about some other secondary pests that gain significance here in the north. They are not really considered primary pests that would, again, kill the trees, but they are definitely of interest because some of them are changing behaviors. Like the first top photo, a white-spotted sawyer beetle, is actually only have been known to attack dead trees affected by fires. However, what we see up here is that it now likes to attack stress trees after drought, for example. So it will not only attack dead fire-killed trees, but it also starts attacking those stressed, droughted trees, and actually be the significant agent killing those trees. So we see some patches of it in some areas where there's a lot of pine, especially if there was a big fire nearby, and they would migrate from that fire to those droughted trees. The middle up photo is eastern larch beetle, also pretty common in the Northwest Territories, causing some large mortality. Stripped alder sawfly, so the top right photo, seen occasionally on alder. The only exotic species in this bunch here is the bottom row left photo, amber marked birch leaf miner, very common around Yellowknife. As far as I know, this is the only not native pest that is making an impact here in the territories. And then the multiple pests on one tree issue that I mentioned. So that's also becomes very visible in the dry years. We see when the trees are weakened and stressed, and northern tent caterpillar we already covered. So this is a photo not from the Northwest Territories. It is a photo from the Rocky Mountains, and then you can see the red trees on the slope. So I want to have a real comment on the culprit, and the culprit is the mountain pine beetle, tiny little beetle that has caused a lot of trouble in BC and in Alberta over the last 20 years. And there was a big threat whether this beetle is going to move to the Northwest Territories after they discovered that it can also attack jack pine, because originally it was found on lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine is a very close cousin of jack pine. They hybridize a lot, and there's actually a lot of hybrids in the Northwest Territories. So there was a concern that once it gets established in those hybrids or jack pine, then it's gonna cause a lot of damage in pine, especially that it did cause significant damage in BC and in Alberta, and in those jurisdictions have large resources and spend a lot of dollars on controlling it. The controlling of mountain pine beetle is very difficult. The only way you can actually fight it is by cutting down the trees that were affected and debarking them or burning them to prevent the spread, to prevent the flight of the adults and moving to another tree. So very costly, impossible up here if it was to happen. We were very concerned that it may happen. Unfortunately, no, fortunately, we did not had that problem so far, and looks like they are not liking our climate. Those guys do not like minus 35 and below. So if we do have stretches of temperature lower than minus 35, um, then these would be dying off in this temperature. However, we do monitor the territories, especially that area along the border between British Columbia, Alberta, and Northwest Territories. So that rectangle that you see on the map here, this is where we would regularly put the traps and baits and fly to see if there is any activity of mountain pine beetle. And there hasn't been since 2012, when we actually had an incidence of mountain pine beetle attack right on the border between British Columbia, Alberta, and Northwest Territories. In that section, we had successfully attacked trees by mountain pine beetle, but then the wildfires swept over, and pretty much the problem ended right there. So since then we did not see any activity of mountain pine beetle up here. We do have other bark beetles like Western balsam bark beetle in the Liard Mountains, Mackenzie Mountains near Fort Liard. We do have large eastern large beetle that I mentioned, and those are the main ones really. We do not have any other. Oh, there is a secondary pest called Ips pinei, which is pine engraver, and it also affects pine, which is weakened by drought and other disturbances. So this is the mountain pine beetle bait here on this photo. As I mentioned, we do monitor them by to detect absence presence by putting those baits out in some areas. Okay, so now we switch to disease agents. There is not really much I will be talking about here because there's only a few important ones that we see affect trees on a regular basis. One of them is Western gall rust, which is causing branch mortality on mature trees, on pine mostly. Observed mostly in the Decho, Simpson, Fort Simpson, and Checkpoint areas, and that's where it kind of is concentrated right now. And the other common one that we see quite a lot is spruce needle rust, and this is also this is usually appearing in areas that experience lots of rain and humidity. So those pathogen diseases are usually associated with humid conditions. And last outbreak that we saw of spruce needle rust was in the around Inuvik, and this is also when we saw some reports from the public of some orange substance floating on the rivers, and I think the conclusion was that it could have been a few things, but among these things was definitely the spores of spruce needle rust identified by the pathologist at the Canadian Forest Service. So those are the main ones. There are obviously more um diseases that affect our trees, and there are obviously more insects that affect our trees. But those would be a single kind of case things that are not maybe the scope of this presentation. More of a biodiversity thing rather than forest health issue. So here I just want to present you some things that we actually see causing significant damage over large areas. So those would be the ones. And the last, I think, section I wanted to talk about is about some climate-related impacts, if we can, because I think this is really something that is making us different from other jurisdictions, the amount of this kind of damage on our landscape. So not really pests or pathogens, and I apologize, um, the council for that. But really, I think those disturbances are important for pests and pathogens because they make trees weaker and really enable those different pests and pathogens attack the trees much easier. So drought definitely an issue, even though we had last few years pretty humid, especially in the southern, like South Slave and Dachau, lots of flooding on the landscape. But at the same time, you would have upland forest drying out when lowland forest flooding. So those things do not really exclude themselves. And I already this year saw a bunch of dead pine trees between Enterprise and McNally Creek when I was driving up here, caused by drought and winter injury, which is basically a desiccation issue. This is when the temperatures of the air are really hot or warm, but the ground is still frozen. So the trees tries to, photosynthesize and open stomates, and it cannot access water from the ground, and that's when it desiccates. And a lot of trees are, the needles are turning red, the tips of the branches are turning red, and if the situation is prolonged, then the tree simply dies off, and that's what's actually happening on the road between Enterprise and McNally Creek. There is a significant amount of pine affected by this issue. So drought definitely important, and a lot of it on all kinds of species that we see here. But this is another one here, flooding, and large flooding. I mean, by flooding, I mean over 100,000 hectares, for example, north of Providence. Those photos that you see here are from that area, and it's really hard to say what the reason for that is. The reason can be, um, it can have multiple, it can be multiple fold. One of them is associated with large fires in the area. So fires, of course, change the hydrology of the area. The dead trees are no longer acting like a filters and pumps of the water. So the water would simply is released from those areas and drain to the lower areas and floods large areas. And other other reason might be related to permafrost thawing, which is also a downstream effect from the permafrost thaw. For example, Horn Plateau was covered by permafrost on top. Whether it still is or not, I am not sure, but definitely the permafrost was affected by those large fires in 1995. And in early 2000s, we started seeing those huge changes in hydrology and massive amounts of forest, upland forest, was flooded, and we see a lot of tree mortality in this area. So definitely important. Um, so this is just an example map of abiotic disturbance, we call it. The abiotic means not really caused by any insect or disease. And you would see that there's this flooding, drought, but also frost damage or wind damage or snow damage, and things like aspen decline. Basically, something that is we cannot really associate with any insect or disease, and yet we see that the trees are declining, that they are in a bad shape. So we see a lot of that in the date show along the Liard River Valley for aspen, which is over mature there. They're already kind of at the edge of their survival and longevity, but there's also some other things like drought combined. So we see a lot of decline in Alberta and northern Alberta, and it kind of is also moving in to the territories. Other climate-related impacts, so slumping, drunken forest, which is on the bottom kind of left photo. This is actually a phenomenon directly caused by permafrost thaw in the muskeg type of forest where there is a rich lenses of permafrost, and when it thaws, trees lose stability and they just fall in all the directions. So those are examples of the direct impacts of permafrost thaw, for example. So slumping, drunken forest, and then we see increased mortality following spruce budworm outbreaks. Usually takes about 7 years of consecutive spruce budworm severe defoliation to start to see mortality. But with climate and with droughts, this mortality advances much faster. And those photos from bottom top photos are actually from the Wood Buffalo National Park along the Slave River there too, where we see a lot of dead trees following those outbreaks. And another phenomenon called red belting, which is a winter damage. I kind of touched upon it when I talked about those dead pines in Enterprise. So this is something that occurs on the hill and mountain slopes when warm, dry winds like Chinooks produce temperature inversion, causing a thin layer of warm air to be trapped at certain elevation. And trees are exposed to unusually warm air during the day and seasonally cold air during the night. And this alternating pattern combined with frozen soils results in desiccation, basically. So the needles are turning red and injured by that the trees cannot really transpire because they cannot get water from the frozen soil. So red belting is also quite common in the Satu in the Mackenzie Mountains. Anyway, so can we answer the question, are our forests resilient to climate change? Well, we need consistent monitoring and developing baseline information because we do lack that. This is one of the things that make our job really difficult for ecologists up here is we do not have baseline information. What was it before? Like, even if we know what the fire history is going back to 1960s, we do not know what the fire regime was here, 200 years ago or 100 years ago, which is not that far in the past. The same goes for insect outbreaks. We only know what spruce budworm outbreaks look like in the 50s and 60s, but we do not know what was beyond. Has there ever been spruce budworm outbreak in the Mackenzie Delta? Well, we don't know. I'm assuming it hasn't been because of the evidence that we collected, but we cannot be certain. We just do not have this knowledge. We did not monitor these areas back in even 50s or 60s. So it's easy to make conclusions, but we just need consistent monitoring and trying to develop those baseline information for as many issues that we can. Because there are many things that are occurring here that we maybe not even recognize as climate-driven issues yet, but they will be apparent later, like declines. The black spruce decline in the Saktu and the aspen decline we think is climate-related, but there is no certainty yet at the moment. So this is really all I have. I wanted to acknowledge Roger Brett, who used to be our main consultant from the Canadian Forest Service, Northern Forestry Center. He has enormous experience here in the Northwest Territories, and thanks to people like him who have that longer, exposure and experience of looking at things up here, he is able to say this has changed. This is not normal. This is not how it was, early 90s. For somebody like me who has been working here for 9 years, I can only refer to those 9 years that I've seen things. This is not enough. You definitely need this baseline. You need to know how things look when they're healthy to be able to say how things looks when they are not healthy. So having somebody like Roger on board was super useful, and I learned a lot from him, and also other people from Canadian Forest Service that help us with ID and diagnostics. Greg Paul and Todd Ramsfield, pathologists and entomologists who confirm our identifications and help us with a diagnosis with some tricky questions. So with that, I thank you. I hope we still have a few minutes left for questions if there are any. And you can access our forest health reports and newsletters on the ECC website. This is a wrong, I think, address, but yeah, I have to apologize. My presentation was a bit different originally, but I didn't save the last copy, and I found myself evacuating, and this is the most recent version I found. So there's a few mistakes here, but ECC website, you will find forest health news and reports for the last few years. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacob. That was super interesting. I'll invite folks if they have questions to put them in the Q&A box, and we will give those over to Jacob. I have a bunch of questions that I was writing down during the presentation, so I'll try to keep an eye on the Q&A box, but there's none in there right now, so I'm gonna go ahead
for
and
it.
start with some of mine. My first question, you said that we don't have a great understanding of the fire history in the north going back beyond like 1960s or so. I did some work on like peat core analysis in a previous life, and I was wondering if any of that kind of work has been done, like analyzing for charcoal in peat core samples, if any of that work has been done in the north, or if not, do you think that there's potential for that kind of data to inform the fire history?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, it is a great potential actually, because we are the land of peat here, right? So um, definitely those efforts have been ongoing. And by saying that we still do not have good understanding of that regime or fire history beyond, the tract fire history, yeah, I should have said that there is a lot of studies right now going on, including NASAW above program that look at that directly. And we have actually a very interesting program going on right now looking at fire scars, because fire scars are on trees are fantastic information written down on the trees themselves. By looking at fire scars in along the highway, for example, you can not only find information on fires way before our fire history, recorded fire history, but also you can sort of get a good understanding of the extent of these fires along the highways. So there is a project right now led by Canadian Forest Service looking at just at that. So they are looking for old fire scars in trees, and they are able to map actually and track fires going back to 1765 or 1860s, that what burned in this area. And by finding the same scars from the same fires along the highway, they can actually map the extent of that particular fire from 1865, in a given area. So this is a fantastic tool because it uses real data, like you say, the peat cores, or this kind of data, scars, or other that we don't maybe know yet, that are actually using collected information in the field, not modeled. So it's not a modeled information; it's actual data collected in the field is the most really reliable and precious for us at this point. So yeah, definitely a
Cool.
lot of work on that,
Cool.
but still not there.
Yeah, lots of work that could be
Yeah.
done. So many interesting research
Yes.
ideas. I will just note that I think we're having some trouble with our internet connection. I'm getting a notice that like I can't load the Q&A. So for
Okay.
folks online, if you're trying to submit a question, I'm really sorry. I don't think I can receive them. But selfishly, I'll just keep asking my questions. And we can go through a few more of those. If folks online really want to send in a question, you can always try emailing admin@nwtkisp.ca. That's my email. But yeah, for now, um, I'll just say sorry about that, and I'll ask a few more questions of my own. As it's kind of lucky that the internet is down, because as you were going through your presentation, actually, uh,
Oh.
and talking about the aspen sawfly, I I think I have a photo of one of those on iNaturalist. If the internet was working, I would pull it up and like get you to identify it on the spot. But anyways,
Hmm.
that's just my plug for iNaturalist too. If folks are finding insects outside and don't know what they are, download iNaturalist and put your insect photos on there, and great researchers or citizen scientists can help you
Yes,
ID them. It's super great.
definitely.
Um, okay. I had a question sort of out of curiosity. You said that spruce budworm, which is our most important forest pest,
Yeah.
has a preference for white spruce over black spruce. And I'm not you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think black spruce is more common in the NWT in our forests.
Um, I would, yeah, probably. You're right.
Okay.
So you're asking why?
Well, I'm just like, is it really noticeable? Like the
Yes.
spruce budworm is just attacking white spruce. They don't often like overflow
Yes.
into. Wow. Okay. So they have quite
And
a
it all comes
preference.
down to phenology. So timing of bud burst and timing of growing the needles,
Oh.
um, simply white spruce is behind a little bit, and it just fits them better their phenology. So it has to be kind of a matched, phenology of both the host and the insect. And in the Northwest Territories, it just happens to be for white spruce.
Hmm.
Um, that their phenologies work together so that they can take advantage of the host.
Okay.
In other areas, white spruce, is not as synced to their phenology, so they prefer other things like balsam fir, right?
Okay.
If there is a huge outbreak like we have right now, you can see budworm even on larch. So
Hmm.
it can attack black spruce, larch, and of course white spruce. But if there is no more white spruce to attack, they will jump to tamarack or larch.
Hmm.
That's what we saw over the last 2 years here, which was really interesting.
Hmm.
But they're just desperate, right? There's such big numbers that they will feed on anything to
Hmm.
survive. And that's actually
Okay.
the situation right now that we're seeing. We can expect way more, well, at least the same amount of budworm this year as we saw last year. I would think they will continue for another
Hmm.
year at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Another question that I have, which you mentioned that we only really have one alien insect species that is causing damage. I'm sure that there are other species. Well, I know
Yeah.
that there are,
Yeah.
but they're not having significant impact
Yeah.
that we are at least seeing now. That, of course, could change with climate change. But anyways, my question is like, are there any alien or invasive pests kind of on your radar that aren't in the NWT yet, but could move that way in the future? You talked a bit about mountain pine beetle, but are there any others that are sort of, yeah, on your radar?
Yeah, there's always ones because tourists bring them here, and we found, for example, Western hemlock looper in Fort Smith, which is totally out of its range.
Hmm.
And it wouldn't be, well, it's pretty exotic here. I mean, it didn't really establish because the climate was not right, but it was seen around the campground in Fort Smith. That's how it got here. There is no other
Hmm.
way. So there's definitely we have a special interest in campsites and campgrounds where we take a special walkthrough usually to check if there are some kind of things that we didn't expect, like that you wouldn't expect normally. And that was one of the examples. So Western hemlock looper was seen in Fort Smith. There was a year where we saw um, what was it now? One of the caterpillars that is also associated with the south. We saw both in Norman Wells and in Newvik around the airport. I can't remember the name of this thing now. It was just on few minor brush and like shrubs. Anyway, we do not have the variety of species, um, of host species right now, and I don't think we will ever have to be worried about things that are bothering the southern jurisdictions in terms of we're not first choice, definitely of for the spread, but
Mhm.
yeah, we definitely have many things on the radar. And we collaborate with Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, who are responsible for monitoring for exotic forest pests in every jurisdiction here. So we do have we collaborate with them, but they are not really anticipating anything of the kind of a red flag for now
Okay.
that we should be worrying about.
Okay.
Still because of climate, but that can
Mm-hmm.
change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I will note that the Q&A seems to be back up. So if folks do have questions, I think they can now put them in the Q&A box. But maybe because it was down, I'm not seeing any in there right now. So I'll ask one more question. Last one.
go for it.
Um, the it's interesting that you say like that yeah, campgrounds are a spot where introductions happen. That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah,
We have some education campaigns on our NWT KISS website if folks want to check them out around um, Play Clean Go for cleaning all of your gear when you're traveling as a tourist or a local, and also
dome of
buy
firewood.
local, burn local. So I
Yeah.
was curious, do you have any idea these pests, you specifically mentioned Western hemlock looper, do you think that was brought in on firewood or?
No, that must have hitched a ride on the camper, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. The firewood we usually inspect when it's commercial firewood.
Mm,
There's always we request that they report any significant numbers of firewood that are brought from other provinces to the territories, and our forest officers or even myself, we go and check the load and make sure that there is that there is no um, like exotic species of pests in this firewood. So or other logs for that matter, not only firewood. But there are some rules that we have. So, for example, the coniferous species have to be debarked when you bring them over, and or they have to be debarked shortly after bringing them here, and the bark has to be burned. And there are um, some rules that we would like to be followed when it comes to sanitation of wood. Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, yeah, and I'll just plug again our campaign Buy Local, Burn Local, where we
Yeah.
encourage folks, if anyone is coming from another jurisdiction, do not bring your own firewood, or even moving around in the territory. We encourage folks, don't bring your own firewood with you. Get it somewhere near where you will be camping to ensure that you're not moving around forest pests.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
Okay, I have more questions I could ask, but I'll I'll cap it there. And just thank you again for a really fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure folks online did as well. So yeah, thank you to you, and also thanks to everyone online who joined us today. If you'd like to join us for more great webinars this week, you can find information on our website, nwtkisp.ca. That's nwtcispp.ca. Or you can look on our Facebook page, just look us up at NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens. So thank you again to everyone for joining, and thank you, Jacob, for this great presentation amid all the chaos that's happening right
Thanks for
now.
having me.
Great,
Have a great
thanks.
day. Bye.
Bye.